Good evening and welcome to the International Affairs Forum at Northwestern Michigan College. We are very grateful to have you with us tonight, online and here in Milliken Auditorium. And we're so glad you chose to be with us tonight with this unsettled weather out there. I think you chose a good place to be indoors with us. My name is Alex Tank. It is an honor and a great joy to serve as the director of this remarkable community-supported program as we close our 32nd season together. We host hybrid events at IAF, as you know. All our supporting members get those live stream links in their inboxes automatically. You've seen them a time or two. So let's take a moment to welcome online our satellite partners gathering tonight in Leland at the Old Art Building and at the Zonta Club of Rogers City at the Presque Isle District Library. We have 50 at the Old Art Building tonight. And as a special treat, we've sent a pair of emissaries to Leland, and that's NMC President Nick Nisley and IAF business community member Tim Healy of Century LLC. So now that we know they're out there, along with folks on the other side of the state in Rogers City, let's give them all a wave and a cheer. The camera's right there. It's great to have a big group here and a big group in Leland and a good group in Rogers City. This is truly a powerful platform for learning. It's multi-generational, it's long form, it's a deep dive together into topics that we explore, and it's far-reaching in its impact from local students here to Lake Huron, over Lake Michigan, down to Mount Pleasant during the year this year. There's some folks tuning in Ann Arbor tonight, and well beyond in DC and New York and more. So you're part of all of that, so thank you. We are so grateful to share that this evening is brought to us through support from two special event underwriters, both longtime Leadership Circle supporters of IAF and dedicated lifelong learners at NMC. Please give a very warm round of gratitude and applause for Harold and Pam Lassers. Thank you, Harold and Pam, making a big difference in our ability to present these programs. Also, we'll continue the gratitude with our sponsors and share our deep thanks for our IAF Gold sponsors this season, Central Michigan University, Grand Traverse Pie Company, and Thompson Retractor. And next, on to our business community members for sustaining the IAF mission year after year. Great group of businesses and leaders to recognize here. So thank you to our business community leaders. And finally, to all our supporting members whose annual gifts sustain our mission at IAF. Many of you have already renewed or upgraded your memberships to Leadership Circle for next season, and we're very grateful for all your support. Many, many years on end, some of you, so thank you. We're thrilled to see this community growing, and we look forward to serving you all with unique opportunities to learn from superb experts like we have with us this evening, and so thank you very much for your support. A round for yourselves, I'd say. Yeah. Now, before we get into this discussion, here's how we'll run things tonight. First, please silence your mobile devices. That's always important. I did it. Okay, we'll have a Q&A session like we always do. A quick reminder, the Q&A option for everyone in person or online is you can email your questions to iaf@nmc.edu. And folks online can submit questions via the Zoom Q&A function as well at any point during the program. And the last method for our audience here in the auditorium, you can flag down one of our volunteers for a question card. So make yourself visible that you want to show your penmanship and write a question. Okay, now to our speakers for this evening. And my new mode is to keep these as concise as possible. First, Sherri Goodman was the Pentagon's first ever Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. She now serves as Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and is the author of Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. Welcome, Sherri Goodman. And our moderator for the evening, speaking in a personal capacity, Commander Ryan Hahn of the U.S. Coast Guard Air Station Traverse City, leads 130 officers and enlisted personnel in all-weather operations of 3 MH-60T Jayhawks conducting search and rescue and law enforcement operations in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, as well as Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and Lake Huron. Among his many degrees and certifications, he holds a Master of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Please welcome Ryan Hahn. And it is my great pleasure to welcome both our speakers to the stage, Ryan Hahn and Sherri Goodman.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction. I just first want to say it's just an honor to be here. My name is Ryan Hahn. I'm a Coast Guard officer. I've spent much of my career in search and rescue and maritime law enforcement in the Arctic and in Central and South America. I helped draft the Department of Homeland Security's first strategic approach for Arctic Homeland Security, signed in 2021. And Ms. Goodman's work informed a lot of what I did there, and I'm appreciative of that. And it's pretty amazing to be here now and speak with her. I'm now the commanding officer of the Coast Guard Air Station here in Traverse City and an affiliate of the Traverse City International Affairs Forum. I'm honored to facilitate this discussion with you, Ms. Goodman. Her groundbreaking efforts continue to resonate in both the Department of War and also the Coast Guard. She's been a trendsetter all of her life, looking at security with nuclear issues, environmental issues, and of course, climate change. She was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security for almost 8 years in the 1990s, and has been leading in environment, energy, climate, and the Arctic for over 30 years. So her full bio can be found in the program. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's very impressive, and we'll talk more about your work, ma'am, as we go through some questions here. So she's now the author of a new book called Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. Those books are available for sale in the lobby, and there will be a book signing after the discussion. So we'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes today, and then Alex will open the floor for questions from the audience. So with that, Ms. Goodman, do you have any opening remarks?
Well, I just want to say okay, there we go. Can you hear me now? I want to say how great it is to be here with all of you. And Alex made me promise that I wouldn't tell all my friends back on the East Coast how nice it really is here in Traverse City. So, but I can see why you like it so much, and you're such a warm and welcoming community. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you. So we're going to talk about the story of climate and security, threat multiplier, and environmental security. And shall we just dive into the first question, Ryan? And it's great to have you. It's really great to do this with you. And thank you for your service. It's so very appreciated.
Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to serve. Yes, so first question, I'm going to ask a couple of basic questions. So what is climate security, and how do you define it?
Okay, well, I started out, and maybe we'll go to the, are you doing the slides here, Alex? Maybe we could go to the first slide. There we go. Okay, so the basic idea of this book, which really tells the story of my life in environment and climate security, is that over our lifetimes, and I see many people in the room who are as young as I am, and we're still going strong, right? And that there's been a convergence between the traditional pillars of national security and environment and now climate security. So from the Cold War era, from the start of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, on through, if you see on the top arrow, the major markers of the creation of the Warsaw Pact, then the Strategic Defense Initiative, on into 9/11 and the post-Cold War era, the terrorism era, the COVID era of strategic competition, great power competition that perhaps marks the current era. But then also on the bottom arrow, you see the rise of attention and awareness both here at home and internationally to environmental issues, from the Rio Summit in the 1990s, the creation even earlier of the Environmental Protection Agency, the major environmental laws in our country, the Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, many others, and then on into the climate era and the Paris Climate Agreements in 2015. And so now when we think about how do we have security, how do we be secure at home and abroad, it's not only about the arms that defend us, the weapon systems, it's also about protecting our natural resources and our natural environment, so we can have the security of nature and of a place, clean water, clean air, and more. And so that is the concept, in short, of first environmental security, which in the 1990s there were a lot of questions. When I first came into the Defense Department, people said, well, what is environmental security? Why should we even care about that? Well, and maybe we'll just dive into the next, let's go to the next slide. So I'm gonna just tell this story a little bit. So I'm gonna tell you, I started out, and I understand you've heard from some people here who talked about nuclear arms control and negotiating nuclear weapons. Well, I started out my life in nuclear weapons. When I came of age during the Cold War, it seemed that the most important challenges we faced around the world and in our country was the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and the threat of a bolt-out-of-the-blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And I wanted to work on the most important issues of the day. So I wrote, my first book was on the neutron bomb and the dispute between the US and its allies about whether we were going to deploy a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon in Europe, from which we did not do, and I earned the name the Bomb Lady among my friends in an early era. And then, and you can see in the photos here, my first job in Washington was working on the Senate Armed Services Committee for Senator Nunn in the 1980s, and he was a powerful chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I was the first female professional staff member on that committee, and I had oversight of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex at that time. And those were the weapons reactors and processing facilities that throughout the Cold War had produced plutonium and tritium and uranium for nuclear weapons. And they were in places like Hanford, Washington, and Savannah River, Georgia, and Rocky Flats, Colorado, and several sites in Ohio. I don't think any here in Michigan. And during that time, in the 1980s, all of these facilities failed for environment, safety, and health lapses, and because at the end of the Cold War, we were awash in plutonium, and the Reagan administration said we didn't need to produce anymore. So my career then went from weapons to waste, and I found myself helping the Armed Services Committee and indeed the Department of Energy at the time create the first environment, safety, and health programs and environmental cleanup programs for the vast nuclear weapons complex overseen by the Department of Energy. And so then then after that, I went into the Department of Defense in the early 1990s. Let's go to the next slide. And there are really three parts to this journey here. In the 1990s, what is environmental security? Really had three parts. One was cleaning up military bases around the country. In that era, we were closing many military bases because we had excess bases. And President Clinton and Vice President Gore, who was really the environmental conscience of the administration, were determined that we would return much of that property to communities safely for reuse and development and have a job-centered property disposal. And yes, that is me running with President Clinton there around Lake Merritt in Oakland, California, before we did an event at Alameda Naval Air Station just after he had announced in the summer of 1993 a major round of base closures, which was required by law at the time. And so he was determined to sort of get out front of the concerns of many communities with closing bases, that they would lose jobs, and how would we take care of the cleanup. So we worked on that. By the end of 8 years, we had returned 80% of the property for reuse, and much of it has now today been cleaned up. So the second, let's go to the next slide. The second component of environmental security in the 1990s, and I'm so pleased that we have Mike Leonard here, who is like a fellow in arms in this journey on environmental security, because in the 1990s, we really had to learn about natural resources on military bases. Many of which, the Department of Defense, and I'm still going to call it the Department of Defense rather than Department of War, if that's okay with you. Thank you. I want to defend our country, okay? So the Department of Defense is the second largest land manager in the United States after the Department of Interior, with over 25 million acres of land. And because much of that land is used for training and for ranges, it's not developed. And so it has become they've become islands of nature around the country, protecting endangered species and important ecosystems. And one of the important lessons that Mike Leonard and I and others learned in the 1990s was about how to preserve this endangered red-cockaded woodpecker you see on the picture there, which makes its home it drills a nest into the longleaf pine tree, which is an ecosystem that once covered much of the southeastern United States and is today found mostly the best, healthiest stands are on military bases, from Camp Lejeune to Eglin Air Force, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and Eglin Air Force Base, and a number of others. So the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a adverse biological opinion to the Army, which shut down training at Fort Bragg. So what's a general to do? Well, I was privileged to work with many very far-sighted generals who figured out that instead of cutting down this tree, which had been the practice, that you could leave the tree and therefore the nest for the red-cockaded woodpecker in place and actually have more realistic training, and that it would improve training and protect the natural resources. So that was an important lesson that's been learned now over many decades, that we can both protect our natural resources and often improve our military readiness and our training. We just have to be creative how we think about it. Okay, I'm going to go, now let's go to the next slide, and really the third chapter of environmental security in the 1990s was about working with militaries around the world. In that era, at the end of the Cold War, we wanted to lift all environmental boats and sort of share best practices with militaries, particularly in the former Soviet Union, where we were removing a lot of fissile material and nuclear weapons. And at that time, I led this story. These photos tell the story of the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, a sort of a generation maybe before you were working on the Coast Guard Arctic strategy. But at that time, one day the Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, a brilliant man, walked down to my office, and which he usually did not do, because usually I would go to the boss's office, right? So he comes down to my office and he says, "Sherri, I just met with the Norwegian Minister of Defense, and he says that the most important thing we can do in U.S.-Norwegian defense relations, and Norway is a very important NATO ally, is to help deal with leaking Russian submarines that the Norwegians are concerned are contaminating their fishing grounds." And he said, "Okay, that's a problem. Now you go and fix it." So I had to figure out what to do. And from that was born the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, where I spent much time in Russia and Norway in the 1990s. And we developed the cask that's shown in this picture, that white cask, which I'm standing in front of, an earlier version of me. And that allowed us to safely offload liquid waste streams from about 100 sunken Russian submarines in Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula that could be leaking hazardous and/or radioactive waste into Norwegian fishing grounds. We also, very importantly, we spoke at many Russian military academies, and I learned something very important about my uniformed colleagues on these trips. They could always be my designated drinker. That was very important in US-Russian relations, is that you had to spend almost as much time toasting what you were doing as negotiating what you were doing. And after my first trip, I was like, okay, I gotta figure this one out. So, but there was always a uniformed military officer. I don't know if it was a Coast Guard officer, Ryan, but I tell you, the Air Force and the Army guys were, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, Mike, were always willing to step up. So, and go toe-to-toe with the Russians on vodka.
Serve their country, man.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so, okay.
That's wonderful, thank you. So you mentioned Threat Multiplier. So you've talked a little bit about what climate security is. You've given us some examples. Could you tell us what Threat Multiplier is? You coined that term in 2007, and it's still in use today, and it's the title of your book. Could you describe what this term means to you?
Yes, sure. So let's go to the next slide. So in the 2000s, I was at a Navy research organization called the Center for Naval Analysis, and a group of foundations approached me and said, you know, we are working on climate change, and we're having a hard time getting enough traction on this issue. Many people see it as a narrow issue, and we want to expand the range of American citizens and voters who will think seriously about climate change. And we think that national security is a good way to sort of broaden the topic. I was personally very interested. I was interested in that. I was also interested in the assessment of the national security implications of climate change. In the 90s, we had the Kyoto Protocol in 1997-98, and that was the third conference of the parties on climate. I sent the first uniformed military officers to that negotiation in Kyoto, who were very welcomed because they could both negotiate text of a treaty and bring coffee to weary negotiators in the middle of the night, sort of do anything, right? So we came away from that experience not fully understanding how to reduce emissions associated with military operations, and realizing that we also didn't really understand how the effect of rising temperatures, more extreme weather events, rising sea levels were going to affect both global security and military operations. So I set about in the 90s, in 2006 and 7, to bring together the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. These were 3 and 4 stars that I'd had the privilege of serving with in the prior decade, the former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the former head of the Nuclear Navy, the former commanders of both our Pacific Command and our Central Command, and many others. And we went on a climate journey together. And many of them actually started out as skeptics. They said to me, Sherri, okay, we get the environmental stuff, we get the protecting natural resources, cleaning up pollution, all that's fine, but we're not most of them were not scientists. We had a few oceanographers. And they said, but we don't really understand this. So I said, okay, we're gonna learn from the world's leading climate scientists. And we brought in Jim Hansen and other very important climate scientists, as well as our national security, intelligence, and other professionals at a very rigorous research organization we're at, like RAND, Center for Naval Analysis. And after a year of study and assessment, they could see that this was going to change both global security dynamics and change the way our military operates. And so from that was born the first report in 2007, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, and the phrase Threat Multiplier, which I coined for that study, where we said climate change will act as a threat multiplier in the most volatile regions of the world, and will also affect our security in stable regions. Of course, that seems to today so obvious that disruptions in extreme weather event and melting permafrost and thaw in the Arctic and retreating sea ice and rising temperatures are changing global security dynamics and also changing the way the military operates. And so for the last 20 years, this has become a foundation of our national security and of how our military prepares and responds in every region of the world.
So you spoke about some of the international engagements that you had. What do you perceive as the appetite for talking about this issue with the United States, especially as it's changed in, say, the past 5 or 6 years? What's the appetite?
Well, we've obviously had a big change in Washington in the last presidential election, if anybody wasn't looking. So, you know, climate is a 4-letter word in this administration. They don't talk about it at all. But that doesn't mean that people aren't working on it. They're just using different words. So, as an example, the Defense Climate Assessment tool, which was actually first developed, it's called DCAT, Defense Climate Assessment Tool, was first developed during the first Trump administration by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a screening tool to assess the vulnerability of our military bases to climate perils like rising sea levels, extreme weather events, wind, fire, drought, and beyond. And it was so successful that it was taken up by the full Army and then expanded to the entire Department of Defense. And in the last administration, it was also shared with many of our allies, our closest allies, NATO allies, Australia, et cetera. And now it's been renamed. Now it's called the Defense Extreme Conditions Assessment Tool. You can still call it DCAT. It's spelled a little differently, but it doesn't say climate anymore. Okay, so that's, you know, one of these workarounds. That's okay. A lot of other things are not so okay. You ask about the appetite of our allies. Well, in NATO, one of our most important, arguably our most important treaty and military alliance, established a NATO Center of Excellence on Climate and Security just a few years ago. I was there to inaugurate it. I spoke at the first, it's based in Montreal, the Canadians are hosting it. I spoke at the very first NATO Climate Security Summit. I've spoken at several of them. And NATO, as an alliance, is still working on climate impacts to military operations, climate assessments, and they're still doing that even without as many Americans involved today, or many American government representatives involved today. And I think in many ways they wait for the US to come back to the table, but they're not waiting, they're moving ahead because they know this is a real risk and they've got to deal with it.
So bringing this back home, back here to our bases at home, you say that climate readiness is mission readiness. So could you explain that? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you can't, well, maybe we could flip forward a couple of slides to, yeah, there we go. Great. Climate readiness on the home base. And that's that's Admiral Ann Phillips there, who was in command of, at Norfolk, of Expeditionary Strike Group 12 when Superstorm Sandy struck, when Superstorm Sandy struck in 2012. And she had to send ships from Norfolk to New York to relieve the Coast Guard when it got knocked out at Sandy Hook. And the Coast Guard operates the very important port of New York. And so here was, as former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said, the military in a war against nature herself. And we were using the Navy to help operate the port. The Corps of Engineers literally turned the lights back on in New York City. And so you can't operate if you can't adapt to and become resilient to the changing climate. There you see a picture below here of Tyndall Air Force Base, which was heavily damaged in Hurricane Michael in 2018 when the roofs were ripped off the hangars of the F-35. This is in Florida. And despite the fact that climate is not a favored topic right now in this administration, this important Air Force base is being rebuilt as the Air Force resilient, used to be climate resilient, now they would just say resilient base of the future, restoring those hangars, allowing them to withstand much higher winds, and still have the mission base there.
Thank you. That makes sense. You mentioned the Arctic, and I know you have quite a bit of a background in the Arctic. You've been there, you've spent time there. I loved your chapter on the region. Not every U.S. citizen realizes that the U.S. is an Arctic nation because of Alaska and our holdings there, and it's changing. For example, an area of about 2 million square miles is now ice-free in the summer. It's roughly the size of the entire state of Alaska, compared to the mid-1980s. So what trends are you following there?
Well, let's go to the Arctic slide, and I'll start with this story. That's Admiral James Fogo, who as a young submariner went up to the Arctic and did this ice pick maneuver where you see the submarine popping out there, and they can get up. When it goes up to near the North Pole, the sailors can get out, and they put on a baseball hat, play a little baseball, or don a Santa cap and send some pictures home to the family because they've been undersea for a long time. And then he goes back to about the same place near the North Pole. 20 years later, now he's in command of the submarine, but when he gets to this location, he can't do this ice pick maneuver any longer because there's not enough ice. And he finds blue water and plastic waste. So that was his experience on the front lines of the changing Arctic. Now, what does that mean strategically? You see this map behind me that shows the sea routes in the Arctic today. So the sea route, the one along the Russian coastline, the northern sea route that hugs the shallow Russian coastline, President Putin would like to convert into a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. And before the war in Ukraine had very aggressive goals for increasing shipping across that northern sea route. Now, it's slowed since his forces have been diverted and since he can't ship as much oil now, but I would say it's only slowed, it hasn't stopped. And at the same time, you see China has ambitions for a polar Silk Road, which would extend its Belt and Road Initiative to include that northern sea route across the Arctic, and has invested with Russia to extract energy resources in places like Yamal, and also to improve its ability to operate in the Arctic. Russia and China today both have more icebreakers than the United States, and the Coast Guard is finally now developing the next generation of icebreakers, has wanted to do that for a long time, but didn't quite have the funding to do that. And it's actually an interesting story now of collaboration between the United States, Canada, and Finland to develop that next generation of icebreaking capability, or as we call it, national security cutters, so that we can better operate, even though the Arctic is melting and sea ice is retreating, and temperatures are rising almost 4 degrees faster than much of the rest of the planet. It's still a very dangerous place to operate, and we still need those ships to be able to give us presence. Oftentimes in the summer, off the coast of Alaska, there might be more Chinese vessels than American vessels. And indeed, in the last few years, there have been a Chinese Russian exercise in the Bering Sea that forced American fishing boats to move out of their area.
I was there for that, I remember.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe you should tell that story then, Ryan.
Well, bring it back to this region. So according to the Council of the Great Lakes, if the Great Lakes region were a nation, it would have the third largest GDP in the world. But the closed loop of the lakes region in the ecology means that the impacts to one lake quickly impact the others, and it's difficult to mitigate. So if the solution to pollution is dilution, it's more difficult to do there. How might you frame climate security to the Great Lakes region?
Well, you have such an important resource here with your fresh water, and I know many of you love, I just heard this phrase, what, no sharks, no
marine mammals.
Yeah,
whole lot of,
that's why you like it here so much, right? You can have, I'll give you some sharks from Cape Cod. How about that? Well, you have such a great, important, vast freshwater resource here that protecting it from the worst ravages of climate change, whether it's rising water temperatures, rising sea levels, impacts to water quality. I know you care very deeply about that here, as you should. All of that is really essential to the quality of life you have. And people are attracted here because the natural resources are so nice, because the environment is good. And so you want to keep it that way. And I know there are many active organizations here doing research. I've been, for a long time, been active in oceanographic research. I once led the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, and that has included also freshwater resource organizations because there are many of the same issues, even though you don't have the sharks and the marine mammals. But water quality, of course, continues to be very important.
So within the military, we have geographic combatant commands, and those are regions responsible for, the whole world is divided up into regions, and they're responsible for different regions. They have seams, and those seams are often very difficult to get after when things happen and they cross those geographic combatant commands. I'd love to ask you how how do your work in climate adaptation and mitigation work in some of those regions and commands? In other words, not on U.S. soil.
Right. Well, maybe I think we have the slide in there on Africa and the Middle East, perhaps. This is actually, let's talk, this is General Tom Mittendorp. He was the former Dutch Chief of Defense, and he's now my co-chair with the International Military Council on Climate and Security. And he deployed frequently in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and in places that are arid and often suffering from drought. And what we know is that when people are water and food insecure, they are more subject to terrorism. That's why we say climate change can be a catalyst for conflict, because terrorist groups over the last 20 years, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS and many others, have taken advantage of populations that are food and water insecure, particularly attracting young male youth into them to recruit, and then putting in harm's way often the women and children in those communities. General Mittendorp found that in places where he was able to broker water security and water sharing arrangements with his civilian counterparts from NATO member countries, it helped to reduce those conflicts. Now, does it solve all your political problems? No, but we've learned that addressing particularly water and food insecurity, now we live in a time, especially we've learned since the Ukraine war, but even before that, that when food supplies, fertilizers, the global nature of food today, and wheat, for example, Ukraine being a breadbasket, we learned from the Arab Spring that was really sparked by a food shortage, that when food and water become scarce in a region, that leads to insecurity. And so working to address that in advance to become resilient to that, whether it's in natural resources, in food, in water, in management of that water. So much water, unfortunately, is wasted in the agricultural processes today in our own country, but particularly in many other countries around the world, that we could protect many countries and improve their food and water security just by reducing waste in water and food systems.
That makes sense. So moving to a slightly more controversial topic, disinformation. So disinformation is affecting the general population domestically and also abroad. Could you give us some examples of disinformation in the climate space?
Sure. Sometimes you see. I mean, here's was a good example when the hurricanes in Tennessee and Florida a few years ago. At the beginning of this current administration, people were told that they shouldn't rely on FEMA and that FEMA wasn't going to help them. And so they didn't get the help they needed in many regions. And that was just pure mis and disinformation. And often civil servants today or those who are trying to work and support PR are put at risk because they have been branded as the bad guy, which is just wrong. We see this also internationally. Sometimes Russia has accused falsely NATO member allies or the United States of deploying geoengineering techniques when they don't like a weather pattern in certain places, or when parts of the usually very arid Middle East are now experiencing more extreme weather events. We've seen coming out of UAE and other countries sometimes reported disinformation about how certain adversaries might be deploying various cloud seeding techniques to disrupt the weather.
Thank you. So there are, I think, more people who acknowledge climate change as a measurable phenomenon than I remember years ago when I was younger. But not everyone agrees on what to do about it. Given your history working with leaders across the political spectrum, what are some key points that resonate with anyone?
Right. This is a great question, and so timely for our moment, because we need to figure out how we build this bigger tent on solutions, because we're not just going to lower emissions enough to address the climate challenge. We have to become resilient and adapt to a warmer world. And at the same time, we have to think about how we deal with our energy system. You know, today with increasing demands for artificial intelligence and just increasing energy demand overall, growth is growing, and many people, probably here as well, are worried about affordability of energy costs. And what's the right energy solution? We know that energy is the flip side of climate. You know, they're both, that's why we have a climate challenge, is because of the way we use energy. So I will say, for me personally, sometimes I think we've gone too far to demonize different energy sources on different sides. Right now, the current administration doesn't like wind and solar, so they make that, you know. And in the past, we often demonized, you know, fossil fuels. Well, okay, it's great to think about a world without fossil fuels, but the reality is we're still going to rely on oil and gas for many more decades. So what can we do to be responsible about it and decarbonize it and reduce our use, but recognize that, but not demonize all sides of energy? We are going to need all forms of energy, and we have to be open, I think, to thinking about what solutions work in different regions and different locations. Every region has a different solution. Some places have more hydropower, some places have more geothermal. You know, the notion now, actually, since the war in Iran, the interesting change in global energy geopolitics is that we're moving into an era of what people call me-first energy. So people may not want to rely on because you can't get the shipments out of the Gulf of Hormuz today. So who wants to be dependent on that? One view is, well, that makes the U.S. and North American energy exports, oil and gas exports, all the more useful to the world's growing energy demands. But the other side of that is people just want to have their energy at home, whether they want to tap more geothermal, put more solar panels, develop their own wind resources, develop nuclear power, but just have energy that's produced and used at home.
Yeah, that's wonderful. On a related topic, so I've noticed that the people that we get into the military are increasingly able to think and talk about this issue. So I'm curious, as those young people enter the military, and they're looking to serve their country, to defend the nation, but they're also interested and understand the language of climate security that you're using because they've been educated in it. If you could give them a message, what would that be?
Stay the course. That's my message. I spend a lot of my time now working with people who are still working in parts of the government or supporting parts of the government, doing the important, might sound boring, but it's actually what makes the wheels of public policy work, which is writing those strategies like the Arctic strategy, writing the operational plans, writing the directives. How did we, at the end of 8 years in the Department of Defense, when my team and I, when we look back at sort of what were the major accomplishments, and I still have this poster somewhere, it says the top 10 environmental security accomplishments. And number one was the first ever environment, safety, and health metrics for the Department of Defense. Now that might sound boring to some of you, but many of you have been in business and management, and we all know that you can't manage what you don't measure. So figuring out what to measure, how to hold people and units and groups, parts of commands accountable, and then the military is very good at sort of competing so we would have little competitions, who could clean up their bases fastest, or who could have the fewest notices of violation under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. I mean, these were, and then you get rewarded by the top leaders. These are all very important tools of management that help you improve your outcomes. And so I think we've been on that road, and we'll get back to it. Obviously, there's not a lot of focus on that right now from the leadership in the departments. But that doesn't mean that individual unit level or individual bases where you have communities or you're working in states where people are still going to be held accountable for their environmental outcomes, that they're not still doing that. And I'm sure you're doing that in the Coast Guard as well.
Yeah, thank you. So there are some students in the audience online and a few out here. And if you could give them one message, what would that be?
I hope you will still consider careers, environment, and climate security, because it really can make a difference. And you'll have an opportunity to rebuild and come in at the ground level. There's been a lot of brain drain, unfortunately. So many of our science agencies have suffered dramatic cuts to their funding from the National Science Foundation, NOAA, NASA, many others. The whole Wilson Center, of which I was part of with a very important polar institute, the Arctic Public Square in Washington, an environmental change and security program, got doged last year. And so this has happened in many parts of the U.S., and that is going to be a competitive disadvantage. It already is for the U.S. vis-a-vis our adversaries, and even in working with our allies. So get in there, continue your studies, and be ready to rebuild.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think at this point, we're getting ready to open the floor for questions, so I'll pass it over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Sherri. Thank you, Commander Hahn. Ryan, great conversation. We've learned a great deal, and we can continue here with these questions from the audience. So the method is you can email them in, iaf@nmc.edu. You can also submit them through the Q&A in the Zoom chat, and question cards are circulating there. So concise questions are always good, and I have a good concise one from folks at the old art building, which there's a great big number of them out there, which is great. How does active warfare impact the environment? For example, the billions of dollars of armaments being detonated in the Gulf region right now, will there need to be an environmental remediation after that, and what does that look like?
Okay, well, let's just say war is never good for the environment. It just isn't, right? But it doesn't mean that we're not going to have war. We haven't figured that out as humans yet, although sometimes I think if women ran the world, maybe we would have a better chance of doing that. Okay. So, short of that, we're going to have massive environmental remediation programs. I mean, after the first Gulf War, where there was a lot of damage done in Kuwait, that country with U.S. and other international assistance has spent decades cleaning up from the oil and other damage caused there. And certainly that's happening today. The mines, demining. I spent many years leading unexploded ordnance and demining programs in the Department of Defense so that we could reduce those risks on training ranges, both at closing bases and even at active military bases. And then, of course, damage from strikes. And certainly Russia has done a lot of terrible damage in Ukraine that's going to take many years to rebuild. But the fortitude of the Ukrainians is such that I believe they will rebuild that country and reconstruct it in a way that will be a model for future infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. Inevitably, we have a question on AI and the environment. And the question is phrased, why do we keep advancing in AI if it's destroying our waters and lands with data centers and the scale that AI is taking and the scale of environmental impact that it will take? I guess you could answer it from the lens of national security as well.
Okay, great question. And just 2 days ago in Washington, as I moderated a discussion about AI and affordability and the energy systems with representatives from NVIDIA, chip maker, and Siemens Energy and Duke Energy, so both the utilities and those in the AI business. Well, the technology of AI, think of it like it's a genie that's not going to get put back in the bottle. So, technology takes on a momentum all of its own. Now, the question is, how can we harness the benefits of AI? And I think we haven't yet seen enough of those benefits that enough people realize that, wow, maybe we can really get a solution to diabetes and we can solve major other health problems. And AI can itself help reduce right now it's seen as a big energy hog, and then it's got this NIMBY problem, and people don't want data centers in their backyard. And I live in Washington, not far from Data Center Alley out in Loudoun County, Virginia. So, and there's been sort of a bipartisan opposition building across the United States now. It's going to be a major issue coming up in the midterm elections. So, I think we're going to have to figure out how we manage the energy needs of AI. And there are some promising technologies out there that can help us with AI have more flexibility in the energy needs they have for the grid. We have two challenges happening at the same time. We have an aging electric grid in the United States, which even before the AI era was becoming vulnerable to climate impacts from extreme weather events. Where I live on Cape Cod, we often lose power in hurricanes that have become more intense in recent years. And I'm sure you experience that here too, and many more people now have their own generators, right? So that you don't lose power, but often those generators run on propane, okay? But in the future, and this was a big initiative actually in the last administration, and I hope we will really get back to it, which is to have microgrids. And we were deploying microgrids at military bases, and you can have them in communities, you know, so instead of having to, we have to upgrade and improve our national electric grid, but it's vulnerable because it's old. In California, it's got subject to a lot of wildfires. It can be subject to cyber attack or deliberate attack. So we have to improve the grid and transmission, but we also have to distribute energy more locally, produce it more locally, distribute more locally, and that's where microgrids can really help. And then AI data centers have to figure out how not to be such energy hogs, and you know, the big tech companies think they're contributing to some of that with ideas about using nuclear power or other sources. Whether that's going to, you know, whether that will be successful or how quickly that will be successful is unclear. Their pace of wanting to site these centers and produce the most advanced AI LLMs available is probably faster than local regulators can come up with, and utilities can improve our grid. So we've got a bit of a temporal problem, which is also leading now to increased energy prices in many parts of the U.S. And of course, that isn't helped by the fact that we have a war in Iran, which was probably not necessary in the first place. And so that's just adding all sorts of pressure on an energy system that isn't fit for purpose today.
Thank you. So you mentioned earlier the strategic importance of freshwater resources, really the existential importance of freshwater resources. And this question asks, related to Iran, what is or will be the net effect of attacks on desalination plants in the Middle East and related to the environment and security issues?
Well, I mean, desalination is an increasingly common form of providing fresh water across much of the arid Middle East region. So when those plants are attacked, then people lose access to fresh water, and it also results in further contamination of the water supplies. I think that, you know, there isn't, in the Middle East, there are better ways to manage the water, but it's become increasingly scarce. I mean, I've been as has, I think, Carl Ganter, we have a very important freshwater expert who's a local here as well, but I've been in Israel, Jordan, and with the Palestinians who have been working together for decades now through a group called EcoPeace Middle East, trying to bring creative water and climate security solutions to those three areas. And if you go to the Jordan River at the place where Jesus was said to have been baptized, and millions of people go each year to have this experience in that water, it's basically like sewage today. And people go, and then they have to come right out and go into a shower to detox. So, I mean, this is as a result of water overuse and misuse over many decades by many countries, not just the three I mentioned, but also from the upstream users, controllers, headwaters of those rivers in Turkey and Iraq. And so, you know, the water knows no boundaries. And so when you want to come up with a solution to managing water, you have to look beyond those boundaries. Just look at what's the challenges we face today with the Colorado River out west and the fights over water rights. We all know that, you know, whiskey is for drinking, and water is for fighting. So the old adage from Chinatown. So we have to become, we've seen some good transboundary water agreements over many years, the Indus River, and there have been some others where they're not perfect. They're not perfect solutions, but the parties have worked to manage those. We have a challenge, I think, growing globally. In China controls the headwaters of many of the major rivers of Asia. And so the downstream users from Vietnam, Cambodia, India, and others and Bangladesh really are dependent on and affected by the dams that China has built to manage its own water supply. So continuing those water management issues in a way that provides solution to as many users as possible is very important.
Thank you. I think we'll do one more question from the online audience here. The question is about cooperation. Do you have any recommendations to facilitate cooperations between groups with divergent viewpoints when environmental health is so essential for everyone? Is there a thread of commonality that you have found in your work to weave people into alignment?
Well, the first thing is to be a good listener, okay? We all learn that with our kids, right? You have to listen, be an active listener. We teach when I went into defense in the early 90s, it was an era where there were many major environmental organizations were suing the Department of Defense for Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, what have you, various, and mostly the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, we really didn't want to, as a result, they were very defensive, and they didn't really want to talk to the environmental groups. And I remember that I invited many of the environmental organizations, the Sierra Club, NRDC, others, to come into the Pentagon and meet with me. And most of them said, oh, we've never been in the Pentagon before. And it didn't mean that they weren't going to sue us, but it did mean we started building relationships and try to build some trust. I spent a lot of time trying to build personal, organizational trust. You have to do that in the military too. We say that decisions move at the speed of trust, and so we have to listen to each other and be able to accept different views, which sometimes has become increasingly hard to do because of the polarized society in which we live. But I feel that I was privileged to come of age at a time when, in my first job on the Senate Armed Services Committee, although I worked for the Democrats, we worked very closely with our Republican staff, and we always worked together. We didn't always agree on every policy issue, but we always tried to work together, and we were encouraged by our leaders, by our bosses, Senator Nunn and Senator John Warner, who was the ranking member at the time, later John McCain. We were always encouraged to work together. And so I still see some levels of bipartisanship happening. It's often kind of below the radar today. There are some interesting collaborations among members of Congress today on permitting reform, and they're trying to deal with the fact that, okay, permitting reform, we need to move faster in building new energy systems, but let's say, I just heard the story of the senior Republican saying that we need to make sure it also includes renewable energy, which is what one of the Democrats have been saying. Well, we're happy to do permitting reform, but it's got to include wind and solar. So, if we can get some of those solutions, I think that's positive. It's not the rhetoric that you hear reported in the news or that you hear on your various podcasts or threads, because it's not as exciting, perhaps, newsworthy, but it is the important work of getting to solutions.
Thank you, Sherri. It's very tough to come to the end of a great conversation like this. It really is a testament to your career that a person can make a huge amount of difference through the arc of decades of work. So we're very appreciative for all the vision that you've had and all the relationships you've built and all the change you've made. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to provide an opportunity for final remarks from Sherri, but before I do that, I want to thank you all for supporting and also mention that coming up, some special things for summertime. We usually plan ahead for fall and come back in September, but this year we have partnerships with the Leland Public Library Seminars series, and there'll be 2 of those, July 2nd at 4 p.m., Arc of Fire, Understanding the Connected Wars in Today's Middle East with Dr. Christina Mickelmore, former chair of the Department of History, Political Science, and International Studies at Chatham University. So that's Thursday, July 2nd, 4 p.m. All members, you'll get the live stream link automatically. You don't have to do anything. If you'd like to attend in person, you do need to register for that. So you can check it out on the website, tciaf.com. And then July 14th, In Humanitarianism, the Origins and Purposes of the Modern Refugee Regime. That's with Dr. Laura Robson, Professor of Global Affairs and History at Yale University. That's Tuesday, July 14th at 4 p.m. So those special summer events are going to be very compelling. I would encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter for updates. Make sure you're supporting the International Affairs Forum if you desire as members. And please share your excitement about this organization with your smartest friends and maybe some of those friends who need more education, right? Okay, now, thank you all for your dedication to this endeavor together, and I will hand it over to end just a wonderful discussion tonight with thanks to Commander Ryan Hahn. Ryan, thank you for great moderating, wonderful questions, and thank you to Sherri Goodman.
I'll just say thank you to Commander Hahn. It's really been great to have you here and get to know you, and I think everyone here in Traverse City feels very privileged to have you, a member of the community. So, and I understand maybe a long tenure now member of the community. So, and
Excited to be a local here very soon.
okay. And I can see why you want to keep this a best kept secret here, but the secret's out with me. I promise you, my 92-year-old mother on Cape Cod is not going to be moving here, but maybe some others will. It's really very lovely here, and I guess my parents were. They were both Holocaust refugees who were fortunate enough to escape from Germany in the late 1930s when not everyone could, and that experience for me shaped, how I think about the world. That it's important to give back to help make the world better continually, whatever path you choose, however you choose it. And to do so, whether you do it at a local, national, or international level, but to realize that you can make a difference and that you should make a difference, try to make a difference in your community and in the world, however you lead it. Thank you.
Thank you all once again. We will see you over the summer and next fall. Thank you.